to the North Vietnamese. An Lac, 50 miles north of Saigon, is surrounded by 10,000 North Vietnamese troops. The Saigon government doesn't want to lose a province capital to the North Vietnamese. An Lac, 50 miles north of Saigon, is surrounded by 10,000 North Vietnamese troops.
U.S. perspective on the Vietnam War. When the U.S. entered the Vietnam War, its leaders had several political and strategic reasons to justify their involvement. The containment policy. The U.S. feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow, creating a domino effect. Therefore, they believed that without intervention in Vietnam, the spread of communism would be difficult to control. Opposing the expansion of the Soviet Union and China. The Vietnam War was not just a conflict between North and South Vietnam, but was also part of the Cold War, with the U.S. seeking to prevent the expansion of communist powers like the Soviet Union and China. Economic and strategic interests. The U.S. also viewed Vietnam and Southeast Asia as strategically important for its economic, trade, and national security interests. Protecting the South Vietnamese government was part of a broader global strategy to maintain influence in the Asia-Pacific region. Consequences and reflection. Although the U.S. provided political and strategic reasons for its participation in the war, the eventual outcome was a significant defeat for the U.S., both militarily and politically. The prolonged war resulted in millions of deaths, including around 58,000 American soldiers, and countless casualties among the Vietnamese population. The U.S. not only suffered heavy human losses, but also faced strong opposition both domestically and internationally, especially after incidents like the My Lai massacre and the Tet Offensive. Moreover, the Vietnam War had a lasting impact on U.S. politics, leading to deep divisions within American society and politics, with many citizens protesting the war and opposing military intervention by the government. The Vietnam War was one of the most complex and costly wars in modern history. The U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War not only changed the course of the conflict, but also reflected the political, military, and ideological strategies of the U.S. during the Cold War. However, despite the strategic and political reasons, the consequences of the war for both the U.S. and Vietnam were incredibly severe. The Vietnam War left a profound lesson about military intervention and the long-term consequences it can have. Analysis of the Vietnam War from the perspective of U.S. intervention.
The Saigon government doesn't want to lose a province capital to the North Vietnamese.
Introduction.
An Lac, 50 miles north of Saigon.
The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, is one of the most prominent and controversial conflicts in the 20th century. Although the war initially began as an internal conflict in Vietnam, the intervention of the United States dramatically changed the entire situation and had long-lasting effects on both Southeast Asia and the world.
The Saigon government doesn't want to lose a province capital to the North Vietnamese. An Lac, about 50 miles north of Saigon, is cut off and surrounded by about 10,000 North Vietnamese troops. Highway 13 is the only road leading to An Lac, and these airborne reinforcements will first try to open the road where it's been blocked by enemy forces. Then they'll try to push on into An Lac to reinforce the small government unit that's surrounded in the province capital.
Significant turning point
the weather
in the conflict,
favors the North Vietnamese
not
right
only
now.
due to military
Low clouds
involvement,
and drizzle
but
prevent
also
American
because
and
of its
South Vietnamese
political,
airstrikes on
social,
North Vietnamese
and
positions up
humanitarian
ahead.
impacts.
The airborne artillery is firing on both sides of Highway 13
Before U.S.
to areas where
involvement,
local Viet
the
Cong or North
Vietnam War
Vietnamese
primarily involved a conflict between the government of South Vietnam, supported by the U.S. and Western countries, and the Army of the North, led by the Communist Party under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. After France withdrew from Vietnam in 1954, the country was divided into two regions, the Communist North and the non-Communist South. This conflict had the characteristics of the Cold War, with the US and the Soviet Union standing on opposite sides. After World War II, the US shifted its foreign policy towards the strategy of containing communism. The victory of the Communists in China, 1949, and North Korea, 1950-1953, led the U.S. to intensify its efforts to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War can be divided into several phases, but it is evident that from the early 1960s, when the U.S. began to increase its military presence, the situation shifted dramatically. Beginning of intervention, 1955 to 1961. The U.S. began providing financial and military aid to the government of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. But the military presence of the U.S. was still limited. In the early 1960s, the U.S. not only provided aid, but also began sending military advisors to train the South Vietnamese army in their fight against the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, Viet Cong. Reality of the war and attacks on the homeland, 1965-1973. After the U.S. officially entered the war, large military offensives were launched, such as the Tet Offensive, 1968, a major attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces on major cities in the south. Despite the U.S. efforts to destroy the enemy and protect the South Vietnamese government, they faced fierce resistance from the Vietnamese people and communist forces.